Alone. Written and directed by QuaidStuff. Narration and production by Trey Falco. Featuring Laura Krulik and QuaidStuff. I must admit, I'm having trouble remembering how or when all of this began, but I'll do my best in trying to relay all of the events that have transpired in the world. I wish I could explain the bizarre phenomenon that has gripped the planet. My fear is that no one will be around to read my writing when whatever is happening blows over. I'm creating this brief message as annals to what remains of the Earth once the crisis passes by. My increased paranoia and anxiety have me believe that my time is short, so I will try to convey what I can. I can't really pinpoint where this truly started, but my best estimation would be at the beginning of this year. There were a large number of crimes that were happening all over Europe. It was like a huge spree of random kidnappings and disappearances. This is why it's hard to say when the phenomenon started. People on that part of the world just started vanishing, seemingly into thin air. All of their belongings were still in their homes. There were never any signs of struggle, and not all of them seemed to need a reason to just up and vanish. People just assumed it was criminal at first, and then it started happening in mass quantities. One day there would be a town with an average population, and then the next day, half of it would be gone. That's when the news started to truly pick up on the problem.
Another mass vanishing of London residences occurred late last evening. Officials still have no explanation to why residents of Europe have gone missing. The British government claims that this has been considered an act of war, saying that this is a massive act of terrorism from Eastern power trying to devastate Western infrastructure in preparation for an invasion, and will defend its borders if the disappearances continue.
I never felt as though it was any kind of act of war from a foreign power of any kind. It was too strange. The whole subject felt wrong and disturbing. It was like the feeling you get when someone was telling you a haunted house story for the first time. It was just plain unsettling. I just continued to hope, like every other American, that the issue would be resolved where it began. The whole thing would be resolved and all the people would be found, or at the very least, would stop it. As tragic and selfish as that sounds, I just kept thinking to myself that whatever was happening on the other side of the world would find its way here. About halfway through the year, Europe's missing person crisis hadn't stopped. It was difficult to tell if it had even slowed down. There was barely even a way to predict what was going to happen. People would vanish in droves one day and a whole town would be gone. The next day, someone's next-door neighbor would be gone without a trace. The only thing that could be considered any kind of news was that Russia and China admitted that the same thing was happening to them. People were leaving in mass quantities, and there was no logical explanation. It's hard to say when it started for them, as they were admitting that the only reason they revealed their own pandemic was because of continued threats of retaliation to something that they weren't responsible in doing. Shortly after that, many nations in the Middle East and Africa were reporting the same thing. The one bright side was that this information was different from other reports. Something different, and maybe some of their experts could help to solve this mess before it got worse.
What was once isolated, seemingly, to the continent of Europe has spread across the world. Asia, African, and South American nations are reporting disappearances on a massive scale. At this time, no one has come forward with any reason as to why this has been happening. We encourage you to lock your doors and report any strange activity to the proper authorities. Stay safe. We will relay any information to you as it comes.
The news tried to reassure the public, but it did little good when it started happening here in the States. It was the end of summer when the level of people that were vanishing was really obvious, but I think it was happening before then. In the middle of June, I went to work like any other day. The only difference was that when I arrived, a coworker hadn't come into work. It wasn't like they hadn't taken time off before, it was just that it was a little too convenient with everything that was going on. I got even more nervous when he hadn't shown up for a few days, and I found out that he never told our supervisor that he was leaving for vacation. I think that's about the time it truly affected me for the first time. It got worse very quickly. I would drive down the road and see hardly any cars than I usually would. It got to a point where I would walk into a grocery store and no one would be inside, apart from the preppers and very thin staff. I couldn't say if it was because the people who worked there had vanished or if they just didn't see a point in earning a wage anymore. It suited me just fine. I hadn't had free groceries since I lived with my parents. At this point, I was still in contact with my family. I always called my mother on the way to work and would speak to my father too if he wasn't busy. Now, it seemed like I was calling them whenever I got the chance and vice versa. Things got a lot scarier when I couldn't get in touch with most of my friends, and I stopped seeing people in my neighborhood. It took some time, but I accepted the fact that I was the only person living in my residential area. When it finally turned December, I couldn't get in touch with anyone on my cell phone. I tried to call or text anyone that I had in my contact information, work staff, friends, even ex-girlfriends, but no one responded. I was able to keep current on what was being reported as the internet and television were still functioning pretty regularly. Not many people were updating their statuses on social media. Some celebrities would say something like they were doing whatever they could to help their fellow man, but I never really believed it. It always seemed a little too forced. Most of the information I was getting came from websites, from news channels, and broadcasts. Sometimes I couldn't rely on a specific channel for too long because most of their staff wouldn't show up. And then, newscasts seemed like they were continuing to do their job because they felt obligated to.
Disappearances continue to sweep the nation. The White House has reported that New York City, Salt Lake City, and the entire state of Nevada has stopped all forms of communication. This just in, reports of mysterious figures have been cropping up all over Los Angeles. Civilians are claiming them to be men in dark clothing that are sticking to alleyways and dark neighborhoods to avoid being seen. Experts say that it is the result of mass paranoia and are mere delusions brought on by fear. Whether these claims are true or not, we encourage our viewers to get home quickly and safely. In other news, astrophysicist Dr. Hans Schaefman will be joining us at 5 p.m. to discuss the strange vanishing phenomenon.
The news never stopped being my lifeline. As it got closer to Christmas, there was seemingly no one left in my town. It wasn't small, so maybe there was someone, but there was no way for me to find them. I would often find myself walking down the streets with my portable radio, listening to emergency broadcasts, and often would get food from the grocery stores. One of these days started like any other, but it was different. Honestly, it frightened me. It was the day before Christmas Eve. I left my house and locked my door. I turned around and across the way, I could see what looked like a man standing in between my neighbors' houses. He was dressed in what looked like black pants and a black hoodie with the hood over his head. It was too far for me to get a look at his face. As I looked at him, I felt more confusion than anything. I'd gotten so used to being by myself that I was shocked to see another person. The wind blew and the cold air dried my eyes, forcing me to blink. When I opened my eyes, the figure had vanished. I was completely vexed. I could only think that I had just witnessed a vanishing firsthand, but something inside of me was saying that wasn't what I saw. I stood on my front porch for a moment, then started to walk down the stairs, but I never stopped looking at that spot where the hooded figure stood. I looked away and started to walk down the sidewalk. I headed in the direction of the town's park. One thing that was enjoyable about the vanishing was the solitude in nature. I found it very therapeutic to read a book in the park without much concern of cars or people disturbing me. I was about halfway to the park when I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. It sounded like a person keeping my pace and speed from a few yards behind me. My heart sank, and I stopped in my tracks. Normally, I never would have heard it, but I was the only person left in town. I could hear the crunch of the fallen autumn leaves that no one ever picked up. They began to take small, slow steps, but I couldn't really gather as to which direction they were headed. I finally muscled up the courage to turn around. I twisted my whole body around, and what looked like another hooded black figure dashed behind a small business building. And I could hear it scurry off behind the building, but I hadn't the nerve to run after them. I stood there with a healthy combination of fear and confusion. I'd be overjoyed if I found another person. My question is, why these figures are watching me from a distance and running from me? I was able to find myself my usual park bench. I sat down and gave my vicinity a quick once-over. My fear had subsided, but my general concern was still firmly present. I couldn't find anything of note, so I, as usual, buried my face into my book. I'd say I was reading for almost an hour until I started to feel uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up, and the first thing I saw was a dark hood jerked down underneath the building wall on the roof of a 3-story office building. I tried to listen if I heard anything, but at that point, I couldn't tell if it was someone's voice or just the wind. I felt as though I had just enough nature for one day. I began to walk home. I didn't feel like I was being watched or followed at first, but that changed just before I entered my neighborhood. I heard a noise that was familiar and distant. I looked up and could see a commercial airliner flying above my head. It was nice to see, but I couldn't help ponder what it was doing. I hadn't seen one in months. I stared for a moment and it gave me a sense of nostalgia. When I looked down, I saw the curtains of a house open, and a hooded figure was staring right at me. I felt nothing but a jolt of vulnerability and adrenaline kickstart my legs so hard that I tripped over my own feet. I immediately started running as fast as I could towards my house. I didn't look back or even try to fathom what could possibly be stalking me. I just ran. I jolted all the way up my porch, skipping a few steps as I ran. I dropped my keys as I pulled them out of my pocket. I turned to my side to pick up my keys and caught something in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to see what it was. In the same spot where the original hooded figure stood, there were 4 hooded figures staring right at me. My jaw dropped, and another dose of fear mixed with kickstart forced me to open the door to my home and lock it behind me. I went to my living room that was located 1 room over from my foyer. I looked out the window, and there those figures stood. I still couldn't get a good look at their faces. I stared at them for as long as I could. I tried to think of whom those people might be, but nothing was coming to mind. Within a few minutes of me looking at them, they dispersed and walked in all different directions. I tracked them all with my eyes, not giving any of them favor with my attention over the others. I tried to see where they may be going, but I was for sure that I wasn't leaving the safety of my own home. The night passed without incident, but when I walked down to see if those figures were still there, I was shocked by what I saw. There were at least a dozen of these hooded people out walking through the neighborhood. As soon as they noticed me, they walked off in all different directions. When they were past my vision, the neighborhood felt empty again. I ran to my television. I grabbed the remote and turned on the tube to see if there was anything that could explain what was going on. I was always scared of the crisis. I was frightened that I would have to wake up to whatever was happening would take me too, but there was nothing that prepared me for this. I just felt as though whatever was happening was targeting me specifically. I couldn't think. I felt as though I was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The feeling of dread and isolation that soldiers feel when they're trapped behind enemy lines was consuming me. I felt as though whatever had gripped the world was hunting me down. The sensation was so terrifying, like these figures had already taken whatever was left, but they missed me. Now, they were aimed at kidnapping me or abducting me. I felt like the television could help with something.
My group are headed there. Meet us if you can.
This broadcast will repeat.
You won't get any reports from the station anymore. I am a cameraman who worked here last year, which is why I know how to work the equipment. It would appear that the staff has either chosen not to return to the studio or has vanished. So those who are still out there, I'm sure you have noticed the black hooded figures. I can't really explain what they are, but I do believe that they are the cause, if not an effect, of the vanishing crisis. The only things I can say is do not let them get close. If one of them gets comfortable around you, they will begin to gather and gain in number. Once they feel as though they are safe, they get closer and closer to you. I also think they are responsible for the global abductions because I was living with a group of friends that hadn't been affected yet. Then we started seeing those hooded figures. We just assumed that they were survivors, like us. Their numbers increased, and after that they started closing the distance between us. At that point, like usual, members of our group would disappear the following mornings. I have not engaged in a physical altercation, so I cannot recommend fighting them. The only thing I can suggest is that you keep moving. They never seem to be comfortable enough to gain in numbers if you constantly change location. With that, I say keep moving. It is the best way to stay safe. I and my remaining group have tried, and we have successfully stayed together. No one has vanished in a month. Stay strong. Stay safe. Oh, head to Portersville. If you are local, me and my group are headed there. Meet us if you can.
This broadcast will repeat.
You won't get...
The following morning arrived, and the man on the television was right. The number of those hooded people had increased. There were more of them, and it took them longer before they all walked away. It was obvious to me now that they were planning something for me. I spent the whole day packing all that I thought was necessary into my car. Food, water, supplies, and entertainment was loaded up, and I'd marked out a good old-fashioned paper map. I was heading to Portersville. I was determined to find those people. If I find they're in Portersville, I hope we can come up with a more permanent solution. The world is empty, and it appears there's a force out to abduct us. I feel confident, but I've never wanted to find and spend time with people so much in my life. To those who find this journal, whether I've disappeared from this world or you're just nosy, heed my words. Keep moving. Never stop, and do not fear these hooded figures. They appear to be more scared of us than we are of them. And I don't know how long that will last, but have hope. Though the world has tried to fool us, especially recently, you are never alone. Alone. Written and directed by QuaidStuff. Narration and production by Trey Falco. Featuring Laura Krulik and QuaidStuff.